Welcome, Mike. Can you just bring a greeting as we start our...
Well, it feels like I've waited many years for this great pleasure. I've, of course, known your dear leaders for many years now, but it's been my prayer to come and join you. Of course, COVID intervened and stopped some of our plans, but the Lord made it possible. And I can tell you, whatever excitement you feel, it's a dim comparison to the excitement that I feel just being here with you. So bless you. Thank you very much.
Wow. Now, if about a year, maybe 2 years ago, these guys used to call me Mose. Then they started calling me Pastor Mose. Now they call me Apostle Mose. Now, we find it very queer and weird to call you Mike. Like, everyone has been like, ma. So, which one should we use? Because if I'm not careful, they end up calling you Grandpa Mike.
That's fine by me. I think Grandpa Mike's perfect.
Oh, yeah. So we'll call him Papa Mike. Yeah, Papa Mike. Because to us, you're not an ordinary person. This morning I was up in the office and I was reflecting on the fact that you are one of the top 5 people who have most influenced this movement in its history. You are one of the top 5. The other 4 people are the first Uncle Ben and Auntie Joy, who were our pastors when we were St. Francis, where the church we came from to start this church. The others are Andrew Womack, this is a Bible teacher from the US, from whom we learned about grace and faith, because we were pretty much a very legalistic entity until then. And then we have John Maxwell, from whom we learned leadership and started the Harvest Institute, which is helping with leadership development here. And then we have Bishop Doug Howard Mills from Ghana, who a few months ago we were talking and you told me you had been doing research about him, and I was like, what? And then it's just, I know you'd be humble, but it's not that you're the 5th. But because you are the one present, then you are one of those 5 people. So we are very honored, very excited to have you in Uganda. Now, I know we have a whole week of activities. We are hoping we will not wear you out and you're like, oh man, I can't. To go back to Uganda, I need to fast eat spinach if I was Popeye. But I know discipleship is at the heart of all you do and teach and all of that. Tell us a little bit about that. Discipleship.
So when Jesus preached his great sermon, the Sermon on the Mount, he completed that sermon with a parable of the wise and the foolish builder. And he said that the foolish builder builds his house on the sand and the wise builder builds his house on the rock. And he's completing the most famous sermon the world has ever known by telling this story. And so the punchline of that story is the punchline of that sermon is the most important thing to Jesus. And Jesus says, the wise man, the wise person does 2 things. He listens to my words and he puts them into practice. And so a disciple is someone who learns to listen, to attend to concentrate on what it is that God is doing and saying, and then on the basis of that, acting in faith. So the 2 questions that you've come across many times before, what is God saying? What are you going to do about it? That's the heart of discipleship.
Wow. What's the heart of discipleship? What is God saying? What are you going to do about it? And I think you experience that in your missional communities pretty much every week, right? Wow. Tell us a little bit about the journey, your own journey? Like, I mean, we read your books and we are like awestruck and thinking, how does he think? Tell us a little bit about the journey, because we like stories and we connect with stories.
Sure. Well, I came from quite a troubled family. Almost everybody was an alcoholic. And my brother died of the effects of that. And it was quite a troubled, difficult family. And I was raised not knowing what was wrong with me. But eventually they were able to diagnose when I was an adult that I was dyslexic, that I had a mental incapacity that meant that I could not read. But I was an intelligent boy, and so the teachers always expected me to do much better than I did, but I could never read, and therefore I could never spell or I could never write properly. And I didn't read my first book cover to cover until I was 15. And so it was a real struggle for me at school. And then as the Lord began to move in my heart and he began to draw me to himself, it was as though my brain was rewired. And the first book that I ever read cover to cover was the Bible.
Wow.
And it was a missionary from Africa who gave me that Bible. And I read that Bible, and I knew that God was speaking to me and calling me to be an apostle. I understood it to be the word missionary, but missionary and apostle are the same word. They're just from different language groups. And so I began to read, and I had no idea at that stage that, of course, one day the thing that I would perhaps be known for the most was writing books. Because if you can't read, you're never going to write a book. And yet God has turned that story around completely, so that today, of course, even here in this wonderful country of Uganda, you get to read some of the things that the dyslexic boy got to write.
Wow. And I have here two of your most popular and used books here. Building a Discipling Culture.
Yeah.
We've used this for many years, since Tim Lindsay and Rebecca came and introduced us to you.
Yeah.
And then there's this one, Leading Missional Communities. This is like the book around here. Tell us about missional communities.
Yeah.
As a vehicle, because we tried many things for many years, and then 10 years ago we landed on this vehicle, missional communities, and it's been wonderful.
So in the late 80s, long before all of you were born, I was working in a very poor community in London called Brixton. And we began to gather the people, and lots of young people began to gather, and we began to gather in homes. And as they began to gather in homes, I would encourage them to go and do mission and go and share their faith and witness to their friends. And maybe take on a project of cleaning up an area or tidying up a street. But what we found was that the groups were small enough to care, but not big enough to dare. They just weren't brave enough because they didn't have enough people to support them in their mission. And so we began to gather these groups in larger groups, and they became instantly much more effective. And they would gather in people's homes, and maybe there would be worship going on the whole night, maybe for 2 or 3 hours, and the poor guitarist would be sweating and his fingers would be blistered, and people would come in and maybe have a meal and then go out and do some youth work, or maybe go and do some children's work and then come in and have a meal and then do some worship. And this time became an amazing dynamic situation that was the very first missional community that we planted. And I think that was in 1988. And since then we've looked at this and we've realized that, of course, we have a vocabulary of mission, we have a vision for mission, but we need a vehicle for mission. And that vehicle for mission became that missional community, and many people have learned that story since.
Wow. Are there any missional community leaders in the house? If you're a missional community leader, could you stand up and we just celebrate you?
Hey!
Come on now. Yay!
Praise the Lord.
Awesome. Awesome. Thank you. There's a powerful story in one of your blogs of many years ago. You wrote about the impact of missional communities when you were in Sheffield at St. Thomas Crooks. I don't know how it has two names. And there were like 2 or 3 things that were so critical. You talked about the marriages. You talked about when you had to leave a venue that you were using and came back a year later. And you talked about September 11th. And it was so compelling. I was like, I wish everyone knew this.
Sure.
Tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. So we outgrew. I'm from England, as you may have realized, because of this strange accent. In England, I work in the Church of England, and we have very old buildings that are quite small. And so we met in our building, and we had 4 services through the day, and eventually we had no more room. And I went to the bishop, and I said, Bishop, we need a bigger building. And he said, in different kinds of words, but basically what he conveyed to me was, over my dead body. And so I said, well, I'm sure the Lord can arrange that if you want him to, but I thought that. I didn't say that. I didn't say that. And I said, well, we would like to go and meet in the city center, even though it's the cathedral parish. We'd like to meet there in the Olympic gymnasium. And he said, well, I don't think you should do that. And I said, well, I don't have an alternative. I have no more room in the building. Maybe we could do it for an experimental period. And if you say it's an experiment to an Anglican bishop, he has to say yes, because of course you're not asking him to change the world forever. You're just doing it for an experiment. And so he said, well, if it's an experiment, that's fine. And so we went there, and all of my leader friends said, you'll lose all the people if you move to the city center. And I said, well, we'll see. All the missional communities got together. They moved. They put their little flag up on a Sunday morning, and the people who didn't see them could come and gather to them. And so they gathered in their missional communities at the worship time. And then we moved to a bankrupt nightclub, which was the biggest nightclub in the north of England. And they let us have it for £5,000 a year, which was amazing. It's as big as this room. And they said, what are you going to use it for? And I said, we're going to use it for church. And they looked at me. It was very strange. And so we painted all of the building inside white, because it was black when we got in there. And the carpet was covered in beer, so that when you walked on the carpet, your feet stuck to the carpet. And so we got a new carpet, and we put it on top. We didn't need any glue. It just stuck to the old carpet. And we began to worship, and it was a wonderful time. And we saw so many people saved, so many people brought to the Lord. I was just telling some of our friends we would spend a whole night in prayer, and we would be dancing and praising and worshiping, and then we'd send the young people out to the clubs with bottles of water and a bar of chocolate for the young people coming out all dehydrated, and we'd say, come and meet the Lord in the house of the Lord. And they would come, and we would have a fire tunnel where we would sing a song, and they would run from one end of the fire tunnel to the other, and we'd pray for them as they came. And either they were saved, healed, or they were never coming back again at the end of the fire tunnel. We saw some amazing things those nights. And eventually, the fire marshal came and said, you can't meet here because the building is too dangerous. And we didn't know what to do, but the Lord had warned me earlier, saying that we needed to really concentrate on our missional communities. And so we did what you guys do. We just dispersed into missional communities and spent a whole year just renting the biggest buildings we could in Sheffield. And then a year later, we came back, and the Lord had doubled the size of the church in the time that we were unable to worship on a Sunday. So it was a wonderful time.
Come on, people. What? Tell the story about the marriages.
Yeah.
I thought that was profound.
So one of the things that Jesus, of course, does and elaborates on these two questions that he asks. What is God saying to you? What are you going to do about it? Means that you have to live a life that is transparent, a life that is accountable. Because if you answer the question, what are you going to do about it? Then you have to answer the question, what did God say to you? And so if you begin to do that in marriages, of course, it means that many of the difficulties that you've lived with, that you've hidden in your heart, that you've not allowed your spouse to see, that you've not struggled through together, that you've not got to the heart of or the root of. I'll give you an example. Recently, my wife and I, we've really been thinking through our life. We've been married 42 years. And so we've seen many different things. We have wonderful children, all engaged in ministry, and grandchildren who know the Lord. But just recently, I've been conscious of some things inside of me that I couldn't really identify. I didn't know what they meant. I went to see a counselor, and the counselor helped me to go back to my childhood and all of those years where it was so difficult as a child in our home, and the feelings of rejection and abandonment that I felt, that were wounds in my heart that had stayed unhealed. If we had not decided to live a transparent life, a life where we're accountable, where we reveal the weaknesses within, we're never going to get healed. And the only way that our marriages will stay strong is if we recognize that the other person in our life, our spouse, is the principal means of blessing and healing and strength to us. And the idea, of course, is that we learn to share these things in ways that God leads us. We saw that in all of the missional communities. And by the time I finished at Sheffield, we'd been there for 10 years, and there was no one who we had married in those 10 years who had been divorced. We'd seen an entire generation of young people raised up, married, and in strong marriages because they'd lived accountable and transparent lives.
Wow. And it wasn't a few marriages.
No.
I think there's a number you gave. About how many couples did you wed in those 10 years?
I don't know. Hundreds and hundreds. It was so many. I got to the stage where I told people, I'm not marrying you anymore. because it was just too many on a Sunday. We had a whole staff team that used to look after it, but there were hundreds of people.
Hundreds of couples.
Yeah.
Not a single divorce in 10 years in the United Kingdom.
Yeah.
Wow. Now, usually at this point in the service, we have what we call an MC moment, missional community moment, where a missional community comes up and they tell their story. So that's the time we're using. And we know that you're going to bless us this week. We're going to Gayaza today. We'll pass through Chira. Tomorrow, we have things going. Tuesday. Wednesday, MC Live is going to be MC Live with Mike Breen live. Tuesday morning, we have a business breakfast right here at 7 a.m. So if you haven't yet got the link or paid for that, I don't know what you're waiting for. You'll take water if you don't register on time. And then on. And then on Saturday, we have a whole day here with all the missional community leaders, zonal pastors, location pastors, huddle leaders. It is the historic Shepherds Gathering with Mike Breen. Now, I urge you to register for that event. Don't do these things of waiting for Friday 9 p.m. and you're harassing us about how you want to come when you've known all this time. So register early so that we can be able to prepare for you. Any last words to us as a church, as a movement? Right now we have 54 other locations watching us and maybe another 40 hosting centers, and the people who are on radio and TV. And so we want you to give us that prophetic, parental,
So I've been blessed to work with many wonderful leaders around the world. Moses and Sarah, of course, are preeminent among those leaders. One of the leaders that I know well is a lady called Gwen Adams, who works in Alaska, a very cold, snowy place, where there is a terrible scourge on their society of sex trafficking. And she has set up the most effective work in the whole nation, so much so that the FBI honored her as the most effective organization, not even Christian, organization working with the legal services in the whole nation of America. So she got this special award, and she teaches all of the stuff that you learn. And she said to me, the person of peace strategy, where you find the person that God has prepared who likes you, listens to you, and serves you. She says, we've used that over and over again with the women that we're rescuing from the world of trafficking. And she says, but what I teach my leaders is the only way that you can find someone who will serve you, because it's easy to find people who like you and listen to you because you're likable people and you've got something good to say. So of course they'll listen and they'll like you. But serve you is really important, that you learn that the person that God's provided for you is the one that's going to show you grace. And so she says, I teach all my leaders to lead with their need. Lead with their need. In other words, when they're working with someone, they're open and transparent and honest about their needs rather than coming to solve the needs of other people. And she says, when you do that and you position yourself with that humility, miracles always happen. And so this has been something that's been in my mind, that as Jesus sends out the 12 and the 72 to find people who will serve them, how do you find people that will serve you? Well, Jesus sends them out with no food, no extra shoes, no extra coat. He sends them with no friends. He only sends them with their partner in mission. They have to go with their need, being very much clear in their minds. So as we go into mission today, this week, be clear about what your needs are and ask the Lord how the people that you meet will be used by Him to bless you as you bring the blessing of the gospel to them. That would be my word to you.
That is revolutionary. Lead with your need.